Shalom, Israel. Shalom. I want to go ahead and reach out today and start doing a book review series on some of the books that we have in our, in our bookshelf. And brothers and sisters may not have been edified on them yet, so this is a good way to do it. Okay. This book review is going to be on the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina coup d'etat by David B Mccoy. All right. This book, it looks like it was published. Let's see here. Book was published, looks like maybe 2018. Okay. And, the man who did it is not really too high. It's not a hard read. The book itself is about, excluding the references page, it's about 70 pages. And the pages aren't long. There are pictures in the book. So a lot of the pages are very short. Okay. But there's a lot of information here, and it's historical references, pictures, a lot of things that you need to know as far as American history. This book is a very foundational book if you want to understand why the so-called Black areas of development were destroyed in the early 19th century. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, okay? If you want to understand that, this is a really good book to have, okay? And we're going to go over some of that today. Like I said, I got it off of Amazon. It's not too expensive. I probably paid $10, $15 for it, something like that. And really good information, okay? Now, let's move forward. Now, let's figure out who David B Mccoy is real quick, just to give him his credibility. David B Mccoy earned his history teaching degree from Ashland University and his graduate degree from Kent State. All right. After teaching for 32 years, he retired to write short books on a variety of topics. He is also the author of Gullah Culture, right? And he talks about and he's got books on the 1920s, early jazz, and the Harlem Renaissance. So it's a lot of books he has, a lot of good information that you can find, and they're short volumes. So you can read them, you can find specialized topics, read them, and knock them out, okay? But let's get right into it. So the book this is the cover of the book. Like I said, the book is important because it helps us understand the political background of the early American nation, okay? While it was still in the colonies, while it was still in the post-Civil War era, in the Reconstruction era, okay? This is a quote that was in the book, and I thought it was very interesting because, man-made laws are made to be changed. Over time, man-made laws will become outdated and may create difficulties for different people and things like that. And so it's necessary that revolution happens. It's necessary that these laws be changed. And so that's what this quote was kind of digging into at the beginning of the book, kind of setting the stage and letting you know that some of these American laws, most of these American laws needed to be changed. All right. And that says a lot about the political landscape and the importance of politics, which is a separate conversation, especially when you start talking about the law, statutes, and commandments of the Bible. It's a separate conversation, but it's a very important conversation at the same time. Okay, so chapter 1 deals with the end of the Civil War, how Abraham Lincoln had plans to rebuild the country, but not necessarily rebuild Black America, right? And so we got some quotes here. He wanted to get on page 5 of this book, it says that Lincoln wanted to get Southern state governments up and running before Congress met in December in order to avoid the radical Republicans' agenda. All right. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the radical Republicans. And he wanted to avoid that. And so after his assassination, President Andrew Johnson continued in the same course of action. And he actually pardoned many of the rebels and many of the Southern whites that were fighting for the rebel army and the Confederate army. And he pardoned them, leaving them with most of their property intact, except for their former slaves, right? And so these pardons about 13,000 in all, allowed many planter aristocrats and ex-Confederate officers to exercise control over the reconstruction of their states. Now, the importance there is you have white supremacists now that are bitter and upset at the conclusion of the Civil War. And now you're giving them the power to restructure their own states, the laws in those states, and how things are carried out in those states, with the free Black people still living in those states. So you can see where you can already see where the issue is going to happen at. Okay. So these are the radical Republicans. Let's talk about them for a quick second. This is from Britannica. It says, radical Republican, during and after the American Civil War, a member of the Republican Party committed to emancipation of the slaves and later to the equal treatment and enfranchisement of the free Blacks, right? Now, their point was radical Reconstruction. So they wanted to create lasting and helpful programs to support the growth of Black communities and Black entrepreneurship, right? And amalgamate them into the American culture. That's what they wanted to do. But like I said, Lincoln and Johnson were against this, all right? And their policies demonstrated that. All right, I have some outside noise. So, Salakia, hold tight. Okay, so the radical Republicans had to fight against President Johnson, right? And Johnson vetoed some of their actions. But over the vetoes, you know, they continued to get things done. So the radical Republicans passed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which would be a whole nother study, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the 14th Amendment. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is basically like the Civil Rights Act of the 60s in the 20th century, right? It guaranteed people citizenship and that they should be able to vote and things like that. Now, after some Southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, a series of laws called the Reconstruction Acts were passed. This was done basically to force Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, okay? During this process and a little bit before, two political parties emerged, the conservatives, later known as the Democrats, and the Republicans, later known, or, you know, the Republican Party, right? In favor of emancipation and Reconstruction. Now, what's very interesting is this. Nowadays, we know that so-called Black Americans vote along the Democratic lines, right? For the most part. The majority of Black people vote Democratic. But originally, those are the people who wanted you to remain in slavery. Those are the people who wanted to fight against your Reconstruction efforts, okay, after the Civil War. Okay, so that's a historical thing to understand. The Constitution of 1898 was soon approved by Congress, and North Carolina senators and representatives, all Republicans except for one, took their places in Washington. And under this government, the local and state political officials were to be elected by the people. So think about it. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and you have this new government structure where the people elect the local and state political officials. And the reason that's important is because now you have to let your Black citizens vote. So now your Black citizens have voting power to influence the makeup of government. And this is the background for the Wilmington massacre, right? Chapter 2 goes into the actual city itself. Okay, so chapter 2 talks about how Wilmington had free Black families flourishing in the decades before the Civil War, and through savings brought property and established a network of connections, right? Entrepreneurship was wide. The population was close to 50-50, right? But then after the slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, 1870, the addition of these free slaves with those already living there caused the population balance to shift. And there were now more free Blacks than free whites, right? And so you can understand that this tension caused by this would have, you know, the white people of the area feeling insecure. All right. And look at what it says on page 17. Never before and never since have Blacks occupied such a central place in the city's political and economic life as they did in Wilmington from 1865 to 1887, right? And we're talking about elected representatives. We're talking about business owners, banks, okay, grocers, carpenters, blacksmiths. A lot of the skills that were learned in slavery were able to be transferred easily over into enterprise. So some of the Southern whites didn't know how to do these things because they had slaves. And so they had to go to the Black businesses. Very quickly, that captivity or that slavery changed into enterprise for Black Americans, and whites in the area were starting to grow more uncomfortable with this, right? So as more Negroes rose to prominence, their white counterparts began to grow more and more uncomfortable. And as Negroes began to assert themselves in their new role, some whites increasingly became fearful, right? Leaders of the Democratic Party, once they regained control, understood that they had little economic control over Wilmington's Black majority, but they could politically control the town. So they had to do something, they felt like their livelihood and their nation was at stake. And chapter 3 details the propaganda in use by white publications in the area and Democratic government officials in the area, right? So through the use of this propaganda, whites in Wilmington began to gain support against the Negro population, claiming that they were raping people, claiming that the city was unsafe for white women, some of these things, right? And through the use of that, they were able to cause an uproar of the whites in the local area. And so this is very important because now you have newspapers, publications, different things are happening to let people know that it's not safe for them because the Black population has gotten too strong, which is why this image was created, right? And you can look this up. This is in a Wilmington newspaper. Let me see the name of it really quick for you. This picture was drawn by cartoonist Norman Jeanette with a J, to illustrate front page caricatures of Blacks, right? And you can't see it here, but on the left side, the wing says Negro, the right side, the wing says rule, okay? And his arms are stretched out and he's grabbing, it looks like he's clawing at the white people who are trying to run away and get away, right? And so that's how they felt. So they illustrated it, put it in newspapers, and began to cause an uproar, all right? Now, these are excerpts from the Wilmington Messenger in October 28, 1898. My heart, now this was written by a white supremacist, right? A white man named, what's his name again? Excuse me, hold tight. Let me see if I can get his name. Yeah, this is Alfred Moore Waddell, okay? Now, these are his words. And this is how he decided to paint the picture. So he says, and this is on page 34 of the book, but it says, my heart instinctively leaps out to the man who in this crisis talks and acts not like the wretch who fears he will lose $1 or a customer or a vote if he be a candidate, but like an Anglo-Saxon who's stirred by the proud consciousness that he belongs to a race that dominates half the earth and is destined to dominate the whole of it, feels that he is the sovereign and the master on the soil which he treads, and dares all to question who put it to the test, right? And furthermore, he says, you are Anglo-Saxons, you are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. If you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns. So this was the sentiment shared by the Southern whites that they didn't want Black people to vote at the polls. This is what we now know as voter suppression. Okay. This is a sign that was hanged up prior to the massacre. Attention, white men. There will be a meeting of white men of Wilmington this morning at 11 o'clock at the courthouse. A full attendance is desired as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. Right? Now, what you see here is Harry Hayden, which is another major player in the book. But Harry Hayden, he published this. Now, when he published this was years after the fact. Years after the fact. I want to say this is 1936 or something like that. The actual riot occurred in 1898, and little was known about what happened that day. Little was published, and people went on about their lives. But Harry Hayden, in 1936, he wrote this inside of, basically glorifying the actual massacre itself. And we'll go into some of the details of the massacre a little bit later. All right. So firsthand accounts. And once again, Harry Hayden's is from 1936. So let's get his on page 57 of the book. And it says, then the red shirts began to ride and the Negroes began to run. The Africans, or at least those Negroes who had foolishly believed in the remote possibility of social equality with the former masters of their parents, began to slink before the Caucasians. They, the Negroes, appeared to turn primal, slinking away like tigers at bay, snarling as they retreated before the bristling bayonets, barking guns, and flaming red shirts. All right. So he describes it as a triumphant victory. You see what I'm saying? That illustrates white superiority over Black people. Okay. Now let's see what J. Allen Kirk said. He's a eyewitness, and he's a Black man from the time of the massacre. He's an eyewitness of the massacre, and he's going to describe it in his words. On the next page, page 58. Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps, and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets until up in the next day following the riot. All the white people had gone out of that part of the city where the violence was occurring, and an army of men marched through the streets, swords buckled to their sides, giving the command to fire. They went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive, took arms they had hidden, and killed them for the least expression of manhood. They gathered around colored homes, firing like great sportsmen firing at rabbits in an open field. And when one would jump his man, from 60 to 100 shots would be turned loose upon him. His escape was impossible. One fellow was walking along a railroad and they shot him down without any provocation. All right. And the book also records on page 61 that 2 days later, the white Christians of Wilmington attended church services where many ministers voiced support for the coup and congratulated the leaders. The Reverend J.W. Kramer declared that the mobs in the street had been doing God's service. Right? This is a map of the attack. And we can see, where buildings were burned, where gunshots went off. And basically it was throughout the entire city. Wherever Blacks were located, they found them and they brought the violence. Okay. And this is an account from Britannica of the actual massacre. It says in Wilmington, the election was the same story as in the rest of the state, but with tragic differences. As the site of unparalleled Black economic and political empowerment and success, Wilmington was the focus of especially heightened white supremacist enmity. Moreover, Wilmington's multiracial city government remained in place after the November 8th election. Its local government elections not due to be held until March 1899, right? On the morning of, I'm gonna jump down to the bottom. It says on the morning of November the 10th, Waddell led some 2,000 white men in an attack on the office of the Daily Record, which was vandalized and razed. By 1100 a.m., violence had begun erupting across the city, as we just saw the map, with red shirts, militiamen, and white vigilantes turning their guns on blacks, some of whom returned fire. As the deadly melee ensued, Waddell engineered and forced resignation of elected officials. He was subsequently elevated to the office of mayor. So that white man that we read his words earlier, Waddell, he became the mayor later. But they forced elected Black officials to leave the city. Black Wilmingtonians, especially women and children, fled, hiding for 3 days and 2 nights in the swamps around the city and in the Black cemetery. The next morning, prominent Black and white Republican citizens were marched to the train station, commanded to leave, and told that they would be killed if they ever returned. In the coming weeks, some 2,100 Black Wilmingtonians abandoned the city. It is not known for certain how many Black people perished in the massacre, but it's generally believed that as many as 60, and some estimates say 300 or more, were killed.